In the snowbound plains of Alberta, no one could explain why a fire would erupt in broad daylight. No wood, no smoke yet. Snow burned in perfect rings. Inside, blackened hoofprints, deep and deliberate. And every year, the fire returned. Mason, a boy who lost his father in the blaze, walked into the snow, placed an old firefighter helmet on the ground, and waited. But this time, a white horse appeared, bowed to the fire, and left behind a giant hoofprint. No one knows what it means. Only this: whoever the fire leads is no longer afraid of death. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more haunting emotional storytelling films like this one. Under the white breath of Alberta's frozen plains, the world looked like it had been erased and redrawn with only 3 colors: sky, snow, and silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't hum or whisper, but one that watched. On the morning of January 4th, 1985, that silence was broken not by sound but by light. And not just any light. It began with a single flame. No one knew who saw it first. Maybe it was old Mr. Trainer looking out from his porch while feeding his chickens. Maybe it was the kids trudging through the snowbanks on their way to school. But word spread fast like sparks on dry pine. A fire. In the middle of the east field. No buildings, no brush, no wind. Just fire where nothing should burn. By the time the first boots crunched their way across the field, there were already 24 people gathered, wrapped in layers, breath curling like ghosts from their lips. Farmers, teachers, the town's postmen. They formed a half circle around what should have been a bonfire, but wasn't. There was no wood, no smoke, no smell of char. Just a clear, concentrated glow, gold-orange, hovering like it had roots in the snow itself. And when it vanished just as suddenly as it had come, what it left behind wasn't ash. It was a ring, a perfect charcoal-black circle seared into the snow. Inside that ring, nothing, just white snow untouched. But around the edge, 12, maybe 15 hoofprints. Burned, impossibly precise. Each one facing the center, each one scorched deep into the frozen ground like a permanent tattoo. People stood in disbelief. Mr. Harmon, the town's retired science teacher, bent to touch one of the hoofprints and hissed, pulling his hand back. "It's warm," he muttered. "Still warm." A murmur passed through the crowd like a wave, shifting under ice. Somebody asked if they should call the fire department. "No need," someone else said. "They're already here." And that's when Mason appeared. He didn't run like the others. He walked slowly, almost reverently across the flat white, his small figure breaking through the blur of snow with careful, deliberate steps. He was only 10, but there was something unnervingly calm about the way he moved. Like he'd seen this before. Like he'd been waiting for it. His mother, Lena, followed a few steps behind her gloved hand, reaching out once, then falling to her side. She said nothing, as Mason walked straight to the ring of hoofprints and stopped just at the edge. The townspeople made space for him instinctively. Not because they knew who he was, but because of how he stood. Still, upright, staring, Mason's face was pale against the red of his scarf. His cheeks burning from the wind, but his eyes, those didn't blink. They just watched the center of the black ring, like it might bloom again at any second. His boots barely touched the edge of the closest print. He didn't flinch at the sight of the charred snow. Instead, he pulled something from his coat pocket. A small, round firefighter's badge. Old, worn smooth at the edges. He held it tightly. No one spoke to him, not yet. 5 years ago, his father, Daniel Reed, had been the one standing in this field, not to chase a ghost, but to put out an actual fire. The barn from the old horse sanctuary had gone up in flames. It was a late October blaze. Fast. Hungry. The kind of fire that devours its own memories. Daniel had rushed in before backup could arrive. People said he'd gone back for the horses. Others said he never made it past the door. They found no body. Just remnants. The scorched remnants of a man, maybe, but not enough to prove a death. No funeral. No closure. Just questions. And now this. Lena stepped forward, brushing snow from Mason's shoulder. "Come away from there," she whispered, soft but pleading. He didn't move. He was here. Her expression cracked like thin ice. "Mason." "I saw him," the boy said. "In my dream. He was on a white horse. The fire didn't touch him." The words didn't hit like a child's fantasy. They fell like confession, like belief. And the townspeople who overheard shifted, looked down at their boots or back at the prints in the snow. No one said what they were all thinking. But someone muttered, "Could be pranksters. Horsemen. Some college kids trying to mess with us." Another replied, "You ever see fire that don't burn anything, that don't smoke. Harmon, the science teacher, shook his head. It's impossible. There's no fuel, no ignition source. But the marks remained. Lena crouched beside her son. Her eyes were tired, bruised from years of holding in tears and speaking only half-truths. She wanted him to say something else, something easier. But he only looked at the ring and repeated, "He's not gone." And so began the first fracture. In that field of perfect white, a black ring carved itself into the town's certainty. A child who wouldn't grieve like others. A mother who didn't know whether to protect her son's faith or break it for his own good. And a town caught between superstition and science, grief and grace. They called it the fire loop after that. Some said it was a phenomenon. Others refused to talk about it at all. But everyone remembered the prints. Hoofprints. Burned without fire. Without explanation. Facing inward. Like a ring of sentinels watching something none of them could see. And each year, after Mason would return to that same field on the same day, not to find answers, not even to see the fire again, but to listen, to wait, to believe in something bigger than logic, something older than grief, something that left behind no body, no bone, but a message scorched into snow, somewhere between this world and the next. Someone still rides. Mason didn't talk about the dream right away. It took 3 days after the fire ring appeared. 3 nights of him sleeping with his fists clenched around his father's badge before he said anything. Not at school, not to the neighbors who brought casseroles and questions. It happened one night in the laundry room where the dryer was humming like a distant train and his mother was folding towels with mechanical precision. "I saw him," Mason said. Lena stopped folding. The corner of a towel slipped through her fingers and landed softly on the linoleum. She didn't move to pick it up. Mason was staring at the wall, not at her. He was on a horse, a white one. It walked through the fire like it was snow. She turned slowly. "Who?" He looked at her then. "Dad." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the rhythmic thump of the dryer and the weight of memory. "He looked back at me," Mason whispered. But he didn't say anything. Lena felt her breath catch, not in the chest, but deeper, somewhere behind the ribs, in the place where grief stores itself like a ticking fuse. She knelt in front of him, searching his face for any flicker of uncertainty, any sign he was just playing, pretending, reaching for something not there. But his eyes, those were Daniel's eyes. Steady, stubborn, haunted. She wanted to say, "That's just a dream, baby. Dreams lie." But what came out was, "You've had this dream before." Mason nodded, only when the snow's loud. She didn't know what that meant. He didn't explain. And somehow that made it worse. That night, after Mason went to bed, Lena walked into his room with a box of old drawings he kept under his bed, things he'd been sketching since he was 6. She knew what she'd find before she lifted the lid. Horses. Dozens of them. In charcoal, in red pencil. Some galloping, some rearing. Others simply standing in the middle of blank pages, staring straight out like they were waiting to be spoken to. But they all had one thing in common. They were burning. Not engulfed in flames, not screaming in agony. No. These horses were calm. Walking through fire, their manes trailing smoke, their hooves leaving scorched patterns behind them. Lena's hands shook as she picked up one sheet after another. In some there were figures riding the horses, faceless men in firefighter jackets. In others the flames were shaped like rings, just like the one in the snow. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She simply stood up, walked to the fireplace, and started tearing the pages slowly, one by one, feeding them into the flames. The fire didn't roar. It crackled softly, accepting the offering. Mason watched from the hallway. He didn't say a word. He just turned away. The next day he stopped drawing. But the dreams didn't stop. They came in flashes, now. Half images, hooves splashing through light smoke, curling like whispers, the weight of his father's coat behind him. The sound of breathing that wasn't his. He stopped telling his mother. What was the point? She'd already decided the fire was over. But Mason knew better. The town, meanwhile, pretended to move on. People at the grocery store chatted about the cold snap. Kids threw snowballs across sidewalks. The fire ring became a strange local memory, a curiosity rather than a mystery. Some called it the phantom blaze. Others said it was just a methane leak or something to do with static charges from underground rock formations. But Mason heard the way the adults whispered when they thought no one was listening. That fire from last week, no smoke, no burn marks. Hoofprints, though, from where? Exactly. Still, they didn't talk about it too loudly. Because to acknowledge it was to admit something had happened. Something they couldn't explain. And explaining the unexplainable had never been the town's strength. 5 years earlier, it had been easier to just blame the horses. After the sanctuary burned down, The narrative had formed fast. The place was poorly maintained. The animals were wild, unpredictable, dangerous. There had been whispers even before the fire that the land was better used for housing, that the horses weren't native, that they carried disease or consumed too much government funding. When the flames took the stables, and Daniel Reed along with them, the town saw an opportunity. The sanctuary was shut down within weeks. The surviving horses were either sold rehomed or unofficially put down. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew. The fire had been the excuse. Lena had fought back then. She'd gone to council meetings, wrote letters, knocked on doors. But grief has a shelf life in towns like these, and hers had expired the moment she kept insisting there had been no body. Even now, 5 years later, people avoided her in subtle ways. They spoke a little too cheerfully, changed the subject when she walked in, treated Mason like a breakable thing they weren't quite sure how to hold. That winter, when the snow returned with a vengeance and the fire ring reappeared a second time, something shifted. This time Mason didn't go to the field. He stayed inside, sitting on the floor with the badge in one hand and a crumpled photo in the other. It was the last picture taken of his father standing beside a black mare grinning in the sun, his fire helmet tilted too far back on his head, his arm wrapped loosely around the animal's neck. They looked like they belonged to each other. Mason remembered that day. The smell of hay, the way the mare snorted when he tried to feed her an apple, the feel of his father's gloved hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. But mostly he remembered what came after. The sirens, the smoke, the screams. Flashback, October 1980. Mason, 5 years old, standing in rain boots at the edge of the road, watching the sky turn the color of copper. Flames leapt from the sanctuary like they were trying to escape something inside. Daniel had driven past the barricade, his truck fishtailing in the gravel. The last thing Mason saw was the back of his jacket disappearing into orange. "Dad!" He'd screamed, "Dad! Dad!" No one stopped him when he ran forward. It was Lena who caught him halfway to the fence. His arms flailed. His fists pounded against her chest. He kicked, bit, begged, but she didn't let go. He wore his father's helmet for 2 straight weeks after that, even to sleep, and never cried once. Back to present, now in the quiet. Mason sat with the same intensity he had that day. Brows, furrowed shoulders, locked lips pressed together like they might break if he let them tremble. He didn't draw anymore. He didn't shout. But the fire hadn't left him. It had just moved inward. Lena watched him from the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed tight. She didn't know what to say. The psychologist they'd visited in Edmonton had told her that trauma in children can manifest in vivid dreams, obsessive behavior, even fabricated memories. But what if it wasn't fabricated? What if Mason saw something real? What if the town had burned not only the horses, but the truth? She still remembered the protests when the sanctuary had opened. People had said the land belonged to the town, that horses were wild, that trying to contain them was unnatural. Others had said that using them for therapy, especially for children with disabilities, was a waste of resources. Somehow something sacred had been twisted. The place that was meant to be a sanctuary had become a cage. And when it burned, the town hadn't mourned. They'd exhaled. Lena sat down on the floor beside her son. She didn't speak. She just put her hand gently over his, her fingers brushing the worn metal of the badge. For a long time, neither of them said a word. Outside, snow fell in thick silence, the kind Mason would later call loud. And in the distance, just at the edge of town, an orange glow blinked once through the dark. No one saw it, but one horse somewhere deep in the hills lifted its head and waited. There's a quiet kind of rebellion in doing something no one sees. In the weeks following the second fire ring, Mason became quieter. Not withdrawn, but precise, intentional. As if he were walking a path already laid out, one only he could see. He didn't talk about the horse anymore. He didn't mention the dreams. But every afternoon after school, he took the long way home, cutting behind the rusted rail fence where the old sanctuary used to be. Most of it had collapsed or been torn down. The land was technically off limits, but no one patrolled it. What was left wasn't worth guarding: broken wood iron nails, bits of old saddle racks buried beneath layers of snow and time. But Mason knew where to look. He moved like someone on a scavenger hunt designed by memory. He knew which patches of snow thawed fastest, which corners of the ruins still carried the scent of hay. He found an old horseshoe half buried in the dirt, twisted and blackened at one end. He dug it out with bare hands, wiping away soot with the edge of his sleeve. Another day, he found the cracked remains of a photograph sealed inside a plastic sandwich bag. Faded, water-damaged, but still visible, his father's smiling arm wrapped around a white horse with a jagged blaze across its forehead. He took nothing from the land that didn't call to him. and everything he took he kept in a shoebox under his bed. A growing shrine to something he didn't fully understand but felt in his bones. None of it made sense on its own, but together they were clues, pieces of a fire that hadn't finished burning. Wordlessly, he began asking around. Not at school, never in front of kids, but at the feed store, at the corner diner, at the church after service. He asked questions like a grown man might, measured, respectful. Did you ever visit the sanctuary before the fire? Do you remember the horses? Was there ever a white one? Most people shook their heads, said they couldn't remember, said he should be careful asking questions like that. But one man didn't. His name was Cooper, 81. Lived at the edge of town in a house that used to be painted green. The paint had long since peeled, but the porch still stood lined with horseshoes nailed into the wood like trophies. Mason found him there one late afternoon, hunched over a pair of boots he was oiling with care that bordered on reverence. Cooper didn't look up when Mason stepped onto the porch. You Daniel's boy? Mason nodded. You've got his eyes. He paused. And his walk. The old man waved him inside without waiting for a reply. The living room smelled like cedar and tobacco and something older. On the mantel were framed photos, black and white images of horses mid-gallop, their muscles taut, eyes wild, manes flaring like smoke. You want to know about the white one? Cooper said, settling into his chair like a tree folding into itself. Don't you? Mason didn't speak. He didn't have to. I saw it, the man continued. Once, long before the fire, I was training a gelding out near the South Ridge. The wind shifted and there it was, standing dead still at the edge of the trees. What did it do? Mason finally asked. Nothing, Cooper said. That's the thing. It didn't run, didn't spook, just looked at me, like it was waiting for me to say something. Was it real? Cooper's laugh was low, dry. You think all things that are real bleed when you touch them? The boy was silent. I don't think it was just a horse, Cooper said. I think it was something older. Something we tried to put fences around. He stood, moved toward the bookshelf, and pulled down a rusted metal box. From it, he withdrew a piece of leather the size of a palm, burned along the edges, frayed in the middle. A metal clasp still clung to one end, like a broken promise. Found this after the fire, he said. Didn't belong to any of the sanctuary's tack. I knew every saddle, every bridle. This one came from something else. He handed it to Mason. It was warm. The boy didn't ask why. He didn't ask how. He just nodded as if this were confirmation, not revelation. When he left Cooper's house, the wind had picked up. It blew across the snow in long, low waves, brushing against his legs like it was trying to carry him off. Mason pulled his scarf tighter and walked faster. That night, he waited until his mother was asleep. Then he opened the shoebox and laid each item out like evidence. The photograph, the blackened horseshoe, the piece of leather. He didn't arrange them neatly. He just looked at them, one by one, like they might suddenly speak. Then he pulled his father's helmet from the closet. It was a little too big for him now, but not by much. He turned it over in his lap, running his fingers along the edge where the paint had chipped away. Then slowly, carefully, he took the burned piece of leather and pressed it against the inside rim where the liner had peeled back. He tied it in place with a length of string. There was no ceremony, no whisper, no prayer, only breath, only resolve, and a long look out the window where the snow was beginning to fall like ash. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't tell anyone. 3 nights later, when the town had buried itself beneath 6 new inches of snow, Mason walked out of his house just before midnight. The air was brutally cold, but he wasn't shivering. The helmet hung from one hand. His boots made no sound as he crossed the frozen road, then the field. He knew where to go. The first fire ring had vanished by now. The wind and time had erased it. But Mason remembered where it had been. His feet followed a path that didn't need markers. And when he reached the spot, he stopped, stood still, and lowered the helmet to the snow. It didn't feel like an offering. It felt like a question. He stepped back, keeping his eyes on the shape his father used to wear. The leather inside was hidden from view. But Mason knew it was there, tied tight, wrapped like a promise, inside the thing that once protected the man. He missed more than breathing. For a long time, nothing happened. The stars flickered above him, cold and unsympathetic. He almost turned to leave, and then the snow began to melt, just in a small ring. A perfect circle not more than 3 feet across. It hissed like steam, but there was no smoke, no source of heat. Just the snow folding into itself, revealing the helmet in the center, untouched. Then faintly something else, a glow. It came from the helmet. Not flame, not fire, just light. Orange-red, like the final flicker of a campfire before it dies. Mason didn't move. He barely breathed. The ring expanded slowly, the snow receding in symmetrical lines until 12 burnt hoofprints appeared. They formed a complete circle around the helmet facing inward, same as before. But this time Mason smiled, because this time it was an answer. He crouched down, placed one gloved hand on the edge of the ring. It was warm, so was the helmet. And when he picked it up, the leather piece inside was glowing, faintly pulsing, like it had a heartbeat. He pressed it to his chest, closed his eyes, said nothing. The next morning, when Lena found the helmet on his nightstand, she noticed the scent first. It didn't smell like smoke. It smelled like cedar, like sweat and leather and hay, like Daniel. She held it in her hands for a long time, not daring to lift it to her face. Then she saw the leather inside, the burned edges, the clasp. She didn't ask where it came from, because something in her, something old and breaking, already knew. In the fields outside, fresh snow fell over the land, like forgiveness. And somewhere deep in the wind, the soft echo of hooves faded into silence. It was the kind of night Alberta wears like armor thick with wind and weight cold enough to make silence sound like cracking bones. Snow fell in slanted lines, each flake a whisper against the skin. The kind of snow that didn't flutter, it drove. The kind that didn't pile, it carved. Mason stood in the middle of the field. A boy's shaped silhouette against the endless white, holding the helmet that used to belong to a man he barely remembered and never stopped waiting for. His fingers were bare red from the cold, but he wouldn't wear gloves. He wanted to feel it. The weight, the cold, the burn of it all. The helmet rested in his palms like an unspoken prayer. He had walked here again, quiet, invisible, unseen. Past the edge of town, past the line where fences stopped and stories began. Snow licked at his boots with every step. No flashlight, no trail. Just the wind at his back like some gentle hand pushing him forward. Urging. The field stretched around him wide and naked. The trees in the distance stood like witnesses. There was no sound but his breath and the hush of falling snow. He could have been the last person on earth. And maybe in a way he was. Mason lowered the helmet slowly, as if placing something sacred on an altar. He didn't clear the snow. He didn't mark the ground. He just bent at the waist and set it down in the white right, in the spot where the fire ring had bloomed before. Then he stepped back. 3 steps. 4. Until he was just outside where he thought the circle would be. Then he stood still, hands falling to his sides, eyes locked on the helmet. The cold wrapped around his spine like a ribbon of ice. But he didn't shiver. The wind pulled at his jacket, his scarf, his hair, but he stood like stone. Only his eyes moved. Only his breath rose and fell. His face was wet now, not from the snow. From something older. He didn't speak. He didn't call out. He just waited. The minutes passed like lifetimes. Nothing happened. And then, a flicker. Just the tiniest shift of light at the corner of his vision. Like a candle someone tried to hide behind cupped hands. It began as a pinpoint, a pulse. Then it swelled quiet, steady sure. Orange and red and gold curling into existence without sound or source. A flame that didn't consume. A fire that didn't bite. Just there, growing from the center of the field, like it had always belonged. Mason didn't move. The fire spread in a circle, not fast, not wild, but with purpose. It traced a perfect ring around the helmet. As it touched the snow, it didn't melt it in the usual way. No steam, no sizzle. Just a fading snow dissolving into nothing as the fire whispered past, leaving behind not ashes, but hoofprints. 12 of them, deep, clean, facing inward. The flame never touched the helmet. It curled around it like a bow around a gift. When it was done, it stopped. Just stopped. Then stillness, the kind of stillness that sings. Mason stepped forward, slow, reverent. The snow hissed softly beneath his boots, but he didn't notice. His eyes were locked on the helmet, which now glowed faintly at the edges, like it had caught the fire's memory, but not its heat. He knelt, picked it up. The metal was warm, and inside, nestled in the space between liner and frame, was the leather strap Cooper had given him. But it wasn't charred anymore. It was whole, and glowing softly. Not with heat, with something deeper, as if it had been touched by breath, by presence. Mason closed his eyes. His shoulders trembled not from cold, but from the way something inside him cracked clean and full. Not a break, a release. When he opened his eyes again, the fire was gone. So was the ring. The snow had returned perfect, unbroken. No prints, no burn. Just the helmet, just the warmth, just him. He stood eyes wet, but no longer weeping. And for the first time in 5 years, he spoke without fear. "He's gone," Mason whispered. Not in sorrow, not in defeat, but in peace. He went the rest of the way. The wind caught his words and carried them forward past the trees, past the horizon. Behind him, unnoticed until now, 2 porch lights flickered on. Someone had seen. By morning, the town was already talking. Not everyone, not loudly, but enough. They'd seen a glow over the field. Hadn't heard sirens, hadn't smelled smoke. But there'd been something there. A heat you could feel even from a distance. A light that bent, then vanished. Whispers stirred like dry grass. Some called it a hoax. Others, older, quieter, just nodded and looked down at their coffee mugs. At the diner, Mrs. Halpert said she'd seen the boy out walking the next day, alone, hands in his pockets, face calm. She said it with the kind of voice people use when they're not sure whether they're afraid or in awe. "I think he knows something," she said. Mr. Turner, who ran the gas station, scoffed. "Kid's just got a wild imagination." But no one argued. Not really. Later that week, Lena found the helmet on the kitchen table. She froze when she saw it because she knew that smell. Leather and pine, ash and sweat. The scent of Daniel on Sunday afternoons. She picked it up slowly, cradled it in her arms. Inside the leather was warm. Mason came in behind her, quiet. She turned, met his eyes. "Did you go?" she asked. He nodded once. "Did you see him?" He didn't answer right away. Then, with a voice steady and older than it should have been, he said, "I didn't have to." And that was all. She didn't ask more. She just pulled him close, rested her forehead to his, and whispered something into his hair. Something only mothers say. Something only boys like Mason understand. By the end of the week, the story had traveled farther than the field. Teachers whispered it in lounges. Teenagers passed it along like a dare. Old men at the hardware store told it with half laughter and half fear. Some said it was a spirit. Some said it was science. Some said it was just a boy letting go. But a few, just a few, began to believe something else. That maybe not all fire is meant to destroy. That maybe some fire just comes to carry things home. And in the center of all the noise, all the guessing, all the explaining was Mason. Not crying, not waiting, just listening to the wind like it might speak again. And holding something in his chest that no one else could see. Not grief, not hope, but reverence. Because he had stood in the middle of the white and watched the fire bow. Not roar, not devour. Just bow, gentle, deliberate, like it recognized him. And he had bowed back, not in fear, in understanding. The 3rd year, no one called the fire department. No one screamed, no one ran, and no one tried to explain. Because by then, they all knew the signs. The sudden stillness in the wind, the silence that settled over the fields, like a held breath, the faint shimmer in the snow just before the light came. It didn't come with sirens or heat. It came like memory, like ritual. Every January 4th, just before midnight, the light would bloom across the field. Not bright, not blazing, just enough to pull your eyes in. It always began with a soft pulse, as if the land itself were remembering, then grew into a silent ring of fire, perfect steady, and always leaving behind the same thing, 12 burned hoofprints facing inward, and nothing else, no smoke, no scent, no scorched earth. Only a circle of blackened impressions, clean dry, exact as if something had danced there in silence, then vanished back into the snow. The first few years it was just Mason who came. He would walk out there alone, his father's helmet under his arm, his coat zipped up to the chin, his eyes wide and still. He never stepped inside the ring. He only stood at its edge, sometimes placing something small in the center, an old photo, a strip of leather, a note folded into quarters. He never said what he left behind. He never said what he saw, but word spread. People began to come, not in crowds, not loudly, but they came. A father who lost his wife to cancer. A woman whose son drowned in the lake 5 summers back. A teenager whose brother never made it home from deployment. They didn't come for closure. They came for the silence and for what followed it. They came for the moment the fire would appear not to burn, but to trace a path that couldn't be walked. A ring. A race. A ritual. Each hoofprint a step towards something none of them could touch, but all of them could feel. Someone started calling it the unburning. The name stuck. And then came the woman in the red coat. Her name was Linda Wexler, 54, former school librarian. No one had seen her much since the house fire. Her daughter Emily had been 17, a violinist, bright, soft-spoken, the kind of girl who made other people sit up straighter. Gone in minutes. The fire had been sudden electrical. That's what the report said. A faulty wire. No one to blame. But grief doesn't care about explanations. It only knows absence. Linda had kept to herself after that. No holiday lights, no phone calls. Just the sound of a record player through a cracked open window and the faint weeping of strings that would never be played again. Until she showed up at the field. It was the 5th year. She came walking slowly, her red coat a smear of color against the snow. In her her gloved hands, a photograph framed, matted, carefully wrapped in plastic. A portrait of Emily in her recital dress, holding her violin, smiling like she'd seen something the rest of them hadn't. No one stopped her as she walked to the edge of the ring. It had just appeared, still glowing, still warm. Mason stood a few feet away, eyes following her without judgment. Linda stepped forward, one slow pace at a time. Then she knelt, pulled back the plastic, and set the photo in the center of the ring. The snow didn't melt beneath her knees. The fire didn't move. She whispered something, no one heard it, and stood. That was all. She didn't stay to see what happened. She turned and walked back the way she came, her boots erasing her own steps. The next morning, Mason came alone. He found the photo still there. Not burned, not warped. Just dusted with a faint trace of smoke along the edges, like someone had waved it gently over a candle. The image untouched. The glass warm. He brought it to her door. She opened it without surprise. He handed it to her in silence. She looked at the photo, held it to her chest, and said she was never afraid of fire. He nodded once and left. That week she baked dozens of loaves, sweet bread, rye, sourdough. She delivered them to neighbors, to the post office, to the high school where Emily once played. And every January, after she stood at the edge of the field, hand resting lightly on her heart, she never placed the photo again. She didn't need to. Others came next. Each brought something small, a coin, a glove, a name written on torn notebook paper. No one spoke. No one dared step inside the ring. They just left things. The fire never burned them. It never accepted everything either. Some objects disappeared overnight, gone without a trace. Others remained exactly as they were untouched. People began to talk, not loudly, not publicly, but the murmurs were different now. Not fear, not ridicule. Just questions. What decided what stayed? Why were some offerings taken and others left? Was it the object or the person behind it? The town didn't have answers, and maybe it didn't need them, because something had changed. The fire no longer frightened them. The hoofprints no longer made them flinch. When it came, always the same date, always the same way, people didn't look away. They paused. They stepped back. Some removed their hats. Some closed their eyes. A few even smiled. They didn't call it supernatural. They didn't call it divine, but they all called it familiar. Familiar and strangely kind. At the center of it all was Mason. Older now, taller, quieter. He still came every year. Still watched, still waited, but he no longer brought the helmet. He no longer left anything behind, because something inside him had shifted. His mother saw it first, in the way he walked, in the way he listened to people when they spoke, in the way he didn't try to explain what he knew and didn't pretend to know more than he did. But that didn't mean Lena understood it. Not fully. She stood in the kitchen one evening, watching the snow swirl outside the window. Her hands were red from chopping onions, her breath fogging the glass. The fire had appeared again 2 nights ago, and people were still talking about it. She had watched it this time from a distance, and something inside her had stirred. Not belief, not yet, but something close to it. Later, she sat across from Mason at the table. He was eating toast, his posture relaxed. Nothing about him said haunted. Nothing said lost. And that, she realized, terrified her more than anything. Because how could he be so calm? How could he be so sure? How do you know it's real? She asked quietly. He looked up, thought for a moment, then said, because it doesn't ask me to believe. It just lets me watch. She didn't respond. Her chest ached in the strange way it always did when her thoughts became too large for words. After he went to bed, she opened the drawer in the hallway, the one that held her grief. Letters, photographs, old newspaper clippings, and the last note Daniel ever wrote. It had been folded into his uniform pocket when they found it in the wreckage. Half burned, half legible. It read, "If something happens, tell Mason I wasn't afraid." She held the note in her hands, felt the paper crack, felt something else inside her begin to bend. She wanted to believe, but belief was dangerous, because belief meant hope. And hope meant letting go of the control that had kept her from collapsing for 5 years straight. Still that night, she walked out to the field alone. The fire had long since faded, but she knelt anyway, not inside the circle, just outside. She didn't bring anything with her, no offerings, no photos. She just sat and whispered, "I'm still angry." The snow didn't move. The wind didn't answer, but something inside her shifted, because maybe this wasn't about understanding. Maybe it wasn't even about believing. Maybe it was about recognizing that some fires don't burn to destroy. Some just light the way long enough for someone to find the road home. By the time Mason turned 15, words had become a luxury he rarely used. He didn't need them, not the way other boys did. While his classmates filled hallways with noise and jokes and half-truths, Mason moved through the world like a shadow drawn in charcoal, quiet, watchful, deliberate. He had grown into his father's frame, tall, lean, with broad shoulders that made people instinctively expect more from him. But it wasn't his body that made people pause when he walked by. It was his stillness. The kind that didn't come from fear or uncertainty, but from some older understanding. The kind of stillness that made animals stop and look, especially horses. They came from the trees from the valley, from the forgotten corners of land that no one bothered to patrol anymore. The sanctuary was long gone, but its echo remained. And in that echo, the horses lingered. Not in herds, in fragments, feral, skittish, wounded things that moved like ghosts across the snow. Thin flanks, cracked hooves, eyes always wide with waiting. Most townsfolk treated them like problems, broken relics of a failed dream. They complained about them tearing through fences, chewing bark, drinking from cattle troughs. But Mason never complained. He watched, he followed, he listened. And sometimes he helped. The first time he saw the wounded mare, it was snowing. Not the kind of snow that danced. The kind that fell heavy so thick, it blurred the edges of the world. He had been walking the southern ridge, his boots breaking through the crusted top layer when he spotted the red in the white. A flicker. Barely there. It could have been a fox. Could have been nothing. But he knew better. He moved closer. She was down on her side, one leg twisted beneath her, blood staining the snow in a wide arc, like a question that had already been answered. She lifted her head when he approached, but didn't move to flee. Her eyes rolled back slightly, ribs rising like broken wings. She was young, gray-coated, scarred. Her breath came in gasps. There was a hole in her shoulder. Not a large one, but precise. A bullet. Mason didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees in the snow, pulling off his jacket, folding it, sliding it under her neck. He didn't speak. He didn't shush her. He simply placed a hand gently on her side, feeling the heartbeat fluttering under her ribs like a trapped bird. She was going to die, unless he did something. That night, Mason didn't go home. He made a sled from an old door he found near the abandoned blacksmith's shed, tied rope to the corners, wrapped her legs with strips from his own shirt. He moved her inch by inch, dragging her through the snow like a body towards sanctuary. It took hours. The snow never let up, but he made it. To what was left of the old stable, 3 walls, 1 tarp, no roof. It wasn't shelter, but it was something. He lit a fire in the corner, careful contained. Melted snow in an old tin can. Cleaned the wound with hands that didn't shake. His fingers bled from the cold. He wrapped her shoulder with pieces of his undershirt, whispering nothing, just breathing with her. When the sun rose, she was still alive. Barely. By the 3rd day, she stood. By the 6th, she stepped out of the stable and looked at him, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet agreement, an understanding, like she'd chosen to stay. People noticed. Tracks in the snow. Hay missing from the feed barn. Someone saw a figure riding bareback through the lower fields at dusk. A blur, a shadow. A boy and a horse, moving like they shared the same thought. And that's when the trouble started. One morning, Mason came to the stable and found the tarps slashed. Inside, the mare stood trembling, but unharmed. On the wall, spray-painted in red, "Not yours." That same day, the town's animal control officer showed up at the school. They called Mason out of class, asked him questions in the hallway, asked if he knew anything about a wild horse being kept illegally, asked if he'd been feeding it, harboring it. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The next day, a formal complaint was filed. The boys interfering, they said, encouraging the horses to stay near town. It's dangerous. It's illegal. He's a child and he doesn't understand the risk. It escalated quickly. By the end of the week, the sheriff's truck pulled up to Mason's house. But he wasn't home. He was in the field riding. Not fast, not like someone fleeing, just moving slowly through the snow. The mare beneath him calm, steady. Her shoulder healed but still marked by the wound, a raw line that hadn't yet faded. They looked like something ancient, boy and beast, shaped by snow, and silence lit by the thin gold of a dying sun. And at the edge of the field stood Mr. Cooper, waiting. He didn't say anything when the trucks arrived, when the officers stepped out, when the whispers turned into accusations. He just stepped forward, eyes clear, voice low. "He's not breaking any law," he said. "This is public land," someone muttered. "He's not claiming it," Cooper replied. "He's just honoring it. He's keeping a wild horse. He's healing one," the old man snapped. "And doing what none of you had the courage to do after you left them out there, to die." There was a pause, long, heavy. Then Cooper stepped in front of the officers, planting himself like a rooted thing. "You want to take something from him," he said. "You'll have to come through me." They didn't. They turned, left without a word. Mason never asked what Cooper had said. But that night, the old man showed up at the stable with a bag of oats and a saddle blanket that smelled like cedar. "You're doing what I couldn't," he said simply. Then he left the bag on the ground, turned, and walked into the dark. From that night on, no one came for the mare. Not again. They watched from a distance. Saw how she moved now, not like something wild, but like something returned. She didn't bolt. She didn't charge. She walked. She grazed. She let Mason brush her mane in the middle of the open snow. He named her Ember, not because of her color, but because of what survived in her. And one evening, just before the sun disappeared, he rode her out across the ridge. No saddle, no bit. Just a bridle he'd fashioned from scraps, and a whisper between them neither would repeat. The snow gleamed beneath them like a mirror. The wind was gentle, and as they crested the hill, the last light of day caught the side of her neck, illuminating the scar. It shimmered, pink, raw, still healing, but beautiful, like a wound that hadn't closed because it had something to teach. And in that moment it looked just like flame. Mason leaned forward, resting his head against her mane, and whispered something into the wind. Something only she would understand. Not a promise, not a name, just breath and gratitude. Because some fires don't leave ash. Some leave something that still moves, still runs, still answers to the boy who once walked into the snow and never asked it to stop. It was the 7th year. By now the fire had become a part of the town's unspoken calendar, unlisted, unofficial, but felt deep in the ribs of every soul who had ever lost someone they weren't ready to let go of. January 4th came around like a ghost that didn't need a name. And with it came a silence more powerful than snow. Mason didn't speak of it, not anymore. He didn't explain the fire, or the circle, or the hoofprints. He didn't need to. His role had changed. He wasn't the boy who waited on the edge of the ring anymore. He was the one who walked toward it. But this year was different. This year he wasn't alone. Ember walked beside him, slower now, her shoulders still bearing the shadow of a limp that had never fully faded. But she moved with intent, her steps quiet but certain. Snow clung to her legs. Her breath rose in clouds, each exhale steady time to Mason's own. He didn't hold her by the halter. He didn't lead her. She chose to come. In his hand, Mason carried the helmet. Same one, same weight, same burnished leather tucked inside. It had faded to a dull amber, now weathered by time and elements. But it was warm. Always warm. The people were already there when he arrived. They stood back as they always did. Some held candles. Others wrapped scarves, tighter, eyes wide, but soft. No one talked. No one needed to. They watched. Mason stepped into the center of the field. The snow undisturbed around him, untouched since the last storm. Ember followed without hesitation, her ears flicking gently, her body calm. The snow hissed beneath her hooves. He stopped in the exact place he always did. Set the helmet down. Stepped back. Waited. The wind was quiet that night. Even the trees seemed to lean in. Then it happened. A soft ignition. Not with sound, but with light. The familiar golden glow flickered into being, as if someone struck a match in the chest of the earth. It curled around the snow, forming the ring, forming the shape everyone had come to expect. But this time, something changed. The fire didn't stop at forming the circle. It moved, just a little, just enough. And Ember, without prompting, without fear, stepped forward, her head lowered slowly, reverently. She paused before the flame the way a student might, before a page, the way a believer might before an altar. Her ears twitched. She breathed in deep. Then, with a quiet grace that no human could have choreographed, she stepped inside the circle, not to defy it, to complete it. She walked the ring, not hurriedly, not aimlessly. She moved with purpose, her hooves landing precisely in the arcs of flame. As she did, the fire shifted, not flaring, not retreating, but bending gently to her movement. Like recognition, like respect. 12 steps, one full circle. When she stopped, she stood across from Mason. And for one long moment, boy and horse held the space between them, like a rope made of silence. The fire flickered once, then vanished, gone in a blink. But what remained? That was new. Next to the helmet in the place where the first hoofprint had landed, lay a single iron nail. Bent, twisted into the shape of a question mark, blackened at the tip. Still warm. Mason didn't move, didn't speak. But his eyes, those old flame-fed eyes, widened just slightly. He stepped forward, knelt, picked it up between two fingers. The curve of it rested neatly in his palm, sharp and smooth. It didn't belong to Ember's shoe. It wasn't something dropped. It was placed. A message, or a mystery. Maybe both. He slipped it into his pocket, stood and turned to face the people. They weren't clapping. They weren't cheering. They were watching. And many of them were crying. That night something broke open in the town, not with noise, but with motion. People began leaving things. It started simply. A handkerchief. A child's mitten. A note scribbled on the back of a church bulletin. Someone left a gold wedding ring wrapped in velvet. Another, a broken collar from a Labrador, no longer living. A single mother wrote her son's name on a stone and placed it in the center of the ring. None of it burned. None of it was taken. Except some of it was. Sometimes the wind would shift, and the center would empty by morning. No explanation, no pattern, but enough for people to hope, enough for people to return. And each year, the fire would bloom soft and golden, and 12 hoofprints would encircle whatever was left in the middle. People said the hoofprints moved, that they didn't always point in, that sometimes they faced out, as if the thing that came wasn't here to carry someone away, but to wait for something to arrive. They began calling it the guide fire. Some said it was the spirit of Daniel Reed. Others said it was an old spirit older than any man. But it didn't matter. Not really. Because belief is not about proof. It's about what fills the air when proof fails. Mason became a part of the fire. Not in name, not in folklore, in presence. He came every year, never to speak, always to witness. He never left anything again, except once, the 10th year. He stepped into the circle with Ember beside him and placed a photograph gently in the snow. It was a picture of Cooper, old, smiling, arms slung around a young Mason. Behind them a sunset so wide it looked like a sky trying to remember itself. Cooper had died that spring, peacefully, quietly, the way he lived. In the morning, the photo was gone. In its place, a strip of leather burnt along one side, curled into the shape of a crescent moon. Mason tucked it into his wallet and said nothing. Years passed. The fire never failed to come, and the people never failed to gather. They didn't bring cameras. They didn't live stream it. There were no reporters. It wasn't an event. It was a return. A place where the unseen could be felt. Where the unanswered didn't feel cruel. Where the fire didn't consume, but carried. One January, a little girl, maybe 5, approached the ring with a folded piece of paper. She was too small to walk it alone, so her father held her hand. She stopped at the edge of the flame, uncurled the paper, and said, "This is for Nana." The wind caught it as she let it go, and in the morning it was gone. No burn marks, just a single white feather resting in its place. People said it hadn't snowed that night. People said feathers don't fall in winter, but they didn't question it. They let the mystery stand. Because by then the town had changed, not in some grand mapped-out way, but in breath, in tone, in the way they held space for each other. There were fewer arguments at council meetings. Fewer horns honked at 4-way stops. More dogs were adopted from shelters. A memorial garden was built where the sanctuary once stood, and in its center, 12 hoofprints carved in stone, a ring, an invitation. Mason never called himself a healer, never said much at all. He just kept coming. Kept placing the helmet, though. Now he'd long since stopped carrying it home. It lived in a glass box in the garden now, resting beside a bent iron nail, still shaped like a question, still warm. He never called himself a keeper. He never asked to be one. But over the years, Mason became exactly that, the quiet keeper of fire. The one who arrived first and left last. The one people glanced at from a respectful distance, never quite knowing how to speak to him, never daring to ask too many questions. Not because he was unfriendly, but because he had crossed some unseen threshold and never fully come back. There were stories now. They whispered that Mason could see things the rest of them couldn't. That he knew when the fire would come, even before it showed. That he walked with horses no one else could approach. Some said he hadn't aged. Others swore he had gray in his hair at 30. None of them really knew him, and that was how Mason kept it. He lived in a modest cabin not far from the ridge, near the remains of the old sanctuary. He worked odd jobs, mostly manual, mostly alone. He didn't own a cell phone. He never used email. The townspeople respected him, but rarely visited. Except one, his mother. Lena still lived in the same house, though now it felt far too large for one person. Her hands had slowed. Her eyes dimmed at the edges. She moved like someone carrying something heavy that no one could see. And Mason still came home every Friday without fail. He never rang the bell, never knocked. He'd let himself in, take off his boots, and sit at the kitchen table like he'd never left. She'd make him coffee. They'd eat in mostly silence. Sometimes a sentence, sometimes not even that. But there was a language between them now that didn't need words. So when she coughed blood into the sink that spring, she didn't scream. She didn't call for help. She just turned and looked at him with something final in her eyes. "I'm not afraid," she said. "You taught me that." He didn't cry, but he didn't look away. The diagnosis came quickly. Lung cancer, stage 4. Not long. She refused the hospital. "I don't want to die under lights," she said. "I want to go with snow in the windows." Mason built a small cot for her near the back room by the window facing the field. He chopped firewood every morning, boiled tea every evening, sat with her while the sun disappeared behind the ridge. And when her breathing became shallow, more air than sound, she reached for his hand. "If you see him," she whispered, "tell him." Mason leaned in. She didn't finish. Her voice broke on the word, "forgive." And then she was gone. No last gasp, no flash of light. Just gone, like something gently stepping out of its own name. He sat there for hours, still holding her hand. It was the first time he realized how small she had become. Not in size, but in weight. In presence. Like she'd been slowly preparing to disappear for years and had only now completed the work. The room didn't change, but the world did. He buried her the next morning beside the spruce trees she loved. There was no priest, no music, just wind and snow, and the thump of earth accepting her weight. The townspeople sent letters, bread, flowers. No one came in person. They knew better. That night Mason didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, helmet at his feet, ember grazing nearby. He watched the stars blink open one by one, like small promises. Somewhere inside him, something began to shift, not break, but reform. For the first time in years, he felt afraid, not of death, of longing, because part of him wanted to place her name in the fire circle. Wanted to call out to the flames and say, "Take her gently. Show me she's safe." But another part, quieter, older, knew better. He couldn't use the fire like that. It wasn't a service. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a way to undo pain. It was a companion. One that walked beside death, not against it. Mason understood now the fire wasn't there to bring people back. It was there to guide them forward. The white horse he had seen in his dreams as a child, the one carrying his father, it hadn't come to rescue. It had come to escort. And Ember the mare with the scar wasn't just a creature he had saved. She was a living symbol of what came after loss, not as a cure, not as compensation, but as continuity. The next morning he walked into the field with nothing in his hands. No helmet, no offering, just himself. And as he stepped into the clearing, the snow around him hushed like it knew. The fire came minutes later, exactly as it always had, gentle gold precise. But this time, when the ring formed, Mason didn't stop at the edge. He stepped inside, not to challenge, to surrender. He stood in the center, arms at his sides, eyes open to the light. And for a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then across the field, Ember began to walk. Not trotting, not running, walking like gravity didn't apply. She entered the ring and circled him once, slow and deliberate, each hoofprint pressing deeper than the last. And when she reached the starting point, she stopped, lowered her head, and bowed. Mason placed his hand on her neck and closed his eyes. Inside, he spoke to no one, no God, no spirit, only his mother, only his father. He said, "You're both free." Then stepped out of the ring, not looking back. When the fire vanished, the snow was untouched, except for one thing. At the center where Mason had stood was a single pine cone, frozen intact, resting on bare earth. He picked it up. It was warm. He returned home that night, placed it on the windowsill above her bed, and that was it. He didn't need signs. He didn't need to see them again. He had let them go, not with despair, but with grace. Because some flames don't burn down houses. Some flames burn open the door. There was no formal service, no hymns, no programs, no folding chairs lined in rows on frozen ground. Just a white cloth. The townspeople placed it at the center of the clearing, deliberately, silently, on a morning when the frost clung to tree limbs like breath that refused to leave. It was a small thing, folded neatly, weighted at each corner with smooth stones. Someone had stitched her name into it with red thread, Lena Reed. They didn't talk about it beforehand. They didn't organize. They just knew. Mason didn't ask for it. He hadn't spoken much since the burial hadn't returned to the ridge in weeks. But somehow every person in that town knew what was coming, what needed to be honored. And so the cloth was laid, and then they waited. That night the snow fell sideways, blown by a wind that made no sound. It gathered in doorways, curled against windows. The air held the taste of iron and stillness, like the earth itself had stopped breathing. Mason stood alone on the porch, Ember at his side. Her ears twitched, but she didn't flinch. She hadn't needed a bridle in years. He didn't speak, not to her, not to himself. He simply reached for the helmet, his father's, his own now, and started walking. The snow parted before them, like memory yielding to presence. In the clearing, the cloth remained untouched, white against white, like something waiting to be remembered. The wind moved around it, not through it. Mason stepped to its edge, knelt, placed the helmet gently beside it, then stood. He didn't expect anything anymore. Not a sign, not a spark. The fire came when it wanted. And when it did, it wasn't for him. It was never for him. But tonight felt different. Tonight the silence had shape. And just as the town's lights blinked out in the valley behind them, as if the whole world had agreed to watch the fire came, but not like before. This time it split. 2 rings, side by side. One around the helmet, the other around the cloth. They flared open in a bloom of soft gold, their heat like breath on skin. Hoofprints appeared instantly, forming full circles, 12 each. Perfect. Burning, facing inward. Gasps were heard from the tree line where people had gathered quietly. Children clutched their parents' hands. Some people fell to their knees. Others just whispered, "Mason's going. They're coming for him too." A stillness fell that could not be broken by any earthly thing. But nothing happened. Not at first. The flames pulsed gently like hearts. The snow remained untouched outside the rings. No one moved. Not even Mason. Then Ember stepped forward. She looked at Mason, once eyes wide questioning, but he said nothing. Just placed a hand on her shoulder and stepped back. She walked into the first circle, the one around the helmet, and bowed her head. Then she did the same in the second, and still the fire didn't move. But something else had shifted. Because from the east, from the line where the trees gave way to the first blush of dawn, something began to stir. No sound, no shape, just weight, presence, and then there it was, a single hoofprint. Massive, pressed deep into the snow just beyond the circle. Too large to belong to any living horse. Too deliberate to be weather. It pointed toward the sunrise. Not into the circle, out of it. The people watching didn't breathe, because whatever had left that mark hadn't come for Mason. It had come to show him the way back. He looked down at the helmet, then at the cloth, then at the fire, and for the first time in a very long time, he smiled. Not a wide grin, just a soft lifting of the corner of his mouth. An acknowledgement. Then without ceremony, he stepped forward and lifted the helmet, placed it on his head, turned, and walked back through the snow toward the town. The fire remained behind him, glowing gently. It didn't follow. It didn't need to, because this wasn't a taking. It was a witnessing, a closing of a chapter that didn't end in death, but in acceptance. By the time the sun broke the horizon, the fire had gone. The hoofprints remained, but the snow had shifted slightly, just enough to blur the edges. The white cloth still lay between the stones, unburned, unmoved. But beneath it, as someone later discovered, pressed lightly into the thawed earth, was the outline of two horses standing side by side, and a single line of boot prints walking away, facing east, toward the light. No one ever found the source of the massive hoofprint. Some said it was just the wind. Others believed it belonged to something far older than any horse, a creature that doesn't carry bodies, but carries goodbyes. People in town started calling it the final rider. They said it came only when someone had nothing left to hold on to, only when someone was ready to turn back toward the living. That spring, Mason planted a single spruce tree where the two rings had burned. By summer, it had already grown taller than it should have. They say he still visits it once a year, always alone, always at dawn. And he doesn't bring anything with him, because he knows now. The fire doesn't take. It teaches, and the last lesson is this. Sometimes the ones who stay carry the light longer than those who left. It started with a bench, just a simple slab of pine hand-sanded, bolted to two stones set near the edge of the clearing. No plaque, no dedication, just a quiet place to sit. Someone placed it there a few months after the last fire. Mason didn't ask who. Didn't need to. He noticed a few weeks later that someone had added a small lantern beside it. Unlit. Empty, but always standing. Then a carved post appeared, shaped like a saddle horn, anchored deep in the frost-hardened ground. Over the next few days, others brought things: a folded map, a pair of baby shoes, a dog's collar with a worn leather tag. Someone strung a row of bells between two trees, delicate ones that only rang when the wind knew what to say. No one had announced a project. No committee formed, but the space transformed itself. And by the time the first snow fell again, the whole clearing had become a mosaic of memory. Faded photographs sealed in glass jars, torn journal pages tucked into tree bark, names burned into stones, tiny wooden horses placed around the fire ring like sentinels. They called it the saddle altar. The saddle altar. It wasn't holy. It wasn't haunted. It was something harder to define, something sacred and plain. A place where people could set down the weight they'd been dragging. Not to forget, but to remember better. And Mason, he never claimed ownership of it, but every week he returned, not to tend, to witness. Sometimes he sat on the bench. Sometimes he walked the edge of the ring. Sometimes he just stood under the spruce tree that now towered like a guardian in the center. People began to come from other towns, from cities, from provinces away. They heard about the fire that didn't burn, the hoofprints that never melted, the man with no last name, no business card, who spoke quietly and never looked away from pain. But the real change didn't happen in the visitors. It happened in the town, in the people who once laughed under their breath, who once called the sanctuary a failed dream, who once told Mason he was chasing ghosts. Those same people now came early to clear snow from the path. They replaced the candles when they burned down. They mended the fabric on the prayer flags when the wind tore them loose. Even Sheriff Henley, once the first to file the complaint about the feral horses, now arrived every January 4th, a thermos in his hand and a blanket in his truck for anyone who needed it. Mrs. Halpert, who once told her students to stop feeding the fantasy, had become the unofficial keeper of the fire journal, a worn leather book where people scrawled messages, names, poems, or nothing at all. One page just had a single sentence. He was gentle when he left. The town changed not by decree, but by practice. Grief became something spoken out loud, not just swallowed. And belief became something shared not to convince, but to connect. When Mr. Cooper passed, the town held a quiet gathering beneath the spruce. There was no minister, no music, but someone read from his will. It was only one line, not about property, not about possessions. Just this: it was never the horse that needed saving. It was belief. Yours, mine, ours. Afterward, Mason walked into the clearing with Ember, now old. Her mane streaked silver, her legs slower but still deliberate. She stepped forward to the center of the fire ring and paused, then gently lowered herself to her knees. The entire town stood in silence. Some cried, most didn't. They just watched a horse kneel on sacred ground and understood. After that, the town built a small stone arch at the trailhead. Above it, carved in both English and Cree, were 3 words: "Come as you are." No one advertised it, but word spread. People came and brought more than grief. They brought reconciliation, letters of apology, bags of soil from lands where ancestors were buried. One woman brought an urn of her mother's ashes and simply whispered, "She loved horses." The fire came as always, but now it felt different. Not mysterious, not frightening. Familiar, belonging. It no longer marked tragedy. It marked movement. The fire was no longer a question. It had become a bridge. Children grew up with it. Teens came and left bracelets, shoelaces, notes folded into origami birds. Elders came to sit in silence beside the bells and hum songs they'd nearly forgotten. And Mason, he remained. A man not shaped by death, but by what came after. He never preached. He never asked for thanks. He simply stayed. And with each visit, with each winter that passed, the rings became gentler. Not smaller, not dimmer, but softer. Like they didn't need to burn as bright anymore, because the people already carried the light. One year it snowed so hard, no one could reach the clearing. The next morning, when the storm had passed and people hiked in through waist-high drifts, they found the fire ring had formed anyway. And in the center, not a helmet, not a cloth, not a name, just a mirror, small, cracked, tucked into the snow. People looked into it one by one and saw only themselves. It stayed there for months. No one touched it, until a child picked it up, wiped the frost from the edges, and said, "I think the fire wanted us to remember we're part of it too." Mason smiled, didn't say a word, but later that night, he added a new stone to the altar. It was unmarked, but smooth and warm to the touch. He placed it at the foot of the spruce and turned away. The next morning it had shifted slightly tilted toward the sunrise. No one ever moved it. Because some things don't need to be explained. Some things just need to be held. And some fires, some horses, some boys who become keepers, they don't fade. They transform. They didn't teach it in science class, not in textbooks, not in studies, not in official records. But every winter, under the weight of falling snow and the hush of breathless wind, a story flickered to life, quietly, respectfully across Alberta and beyond. A story that had once belonged to a single boy, a lost father, a field scorched by something that shouldn't have burned. Now it belonged to everyone. It started when a therapist named Andrea Pike visited the saddle altar on the anniversary of her sister's passing. She didn't expect anything. She didn't even believe. But she left a bracelet, a cheap plastic thing her sister used to wear when they played in the garden as kids, and in the morning it was gone. In its place, a single stone, perfectly smooth, warm to the touch despite the ice. She didn't tell anyone for weeks. Then she wrote an article, part memoir, part study, about symbolic grief and shared mythologies, citing the white horse fire phenomenon as a case of communal healing through metaphor. She called the story of Mason Reed and the rings of fire a natural intervention for unnatural loss. She was invited to speak at a grief conference in Toronto. The following year, the White Horse Project was born. It wasn't government-run. It wasn't institutional. It was community-led therapy, held in schools, recovery centers, veterans' homes. A program built around the belief that not every goodbye has to come with darkness, that sometimes fire can carry, not destroy. It used storytelling art therapy, equine interaction. Kids painted hoofprints on snow-covered fields. Families placed letters in candlelit circles. Elderly widows planted spruce trees in memory of their partners, and they all told the same story however they wanted, about a white horse and a fire that knew its way. One girl, barely 10, stood in front of a group in Edmonton and said, "When our house burned, I saw the light outside my window. It wasn't scary. It felt like someone was there walking with me, like they were leading me away from the flames." She paused, swallowed. "I think it was the horse." Her voice didn't tremble, and no one laughed. The story no longer belonged to Mason. But he didn't mind. Because that was the point. It had traveled farther than he ever could. The field where it all began, where his father disappeared, where his mother whispered forgiveness, where the hoofprints appeared, was now surrounded by quiet paths and wooden signs written in 3 languages, English, Cree, and silence. And every year new people came. Some walked alone, some came with children. Some couldn't walk at all, so they were carried. They left ribbons, rings, sketches of horses. They didn't expect miracles. They came to remember how to breathe. One winter, a little boy who had lost both parents in a fire drew a horse with crayons and placed it at the center of the ring. When he returned the next morning, the paper was still there, but something new had been drawn beside it. 12 tiny hoofprints in charcoal. No one claimed them. No one needed to, because by then they understood. The fire doesn't explain itself. It just arrives when it's needed. And so did Mason. Still quiet, still walking, still holding space, but different now. Not because the weight was gone, but because he had learned how to carry it differently. He came to the clearing before sunrise that year. Ember long past the wind, soft as a mother's breath. He sat in the snow without a coat, the cold kissing his skin, but not biting. His hands rested on his knees. He didn't bring anything, because there was nothing left to offer. And then, like it had so many times before the snow shifted, the fire appeared. But this time it didn't form a perfect circle. It didn't flare wide. It crept toward him gently, like an animal unsure if it was still welcome, and stopped just short of his boots. Then, hoofprints, not burned, not scorched, just impressions, forming slowly, one by one around him. 12, then 13, then more, surrounding him. And for the first time in all those years, Mason smiled with his whole face, not just lips, eyes, spine. He closed his eyes and leaned forward, letting the cold press against his forehead. The wind moved around him, not like threat, but like invitation. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because the hoofprints didn't burn anymore. They remembered. They didn't mark loss. They marked presence. And as the sun cracked the horizon and spilled light across the white, the prints faded, not melted, just faded. Back into snow, back into story, back into something we don't need to see to know. Mason stood brushing snow from his shoulders. Behind him, the fire vanished. Ahead of him, only sky. He turned toward the east, the place of beginnings, and walked. Each step deliberate, each breath light. And if someone had watched from the trees, they might have said the wind shifted with him, that the snow beneath his feet didn't collapse, but lifted, that something ancient had bowed to let him pass. And long after he was gone, the clearing stayed silent. Still, but not empty, because in the snow, faint and sacred, a line of hoofprints curved gently toward the rising sun. Not blackened, not burned, just there, because some fires don't need to be seen to be felt, and some journeys don't end, they arrive.